In November 1969, President Richard Nixon made a startling declaration.
The United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
Nixon's announcement was widely acclaimed, yet few Americans knew that for more than 25 years, the United States had been operating an extensive research program to harness germs as weapons of mass destruction. Born during a terrible world war, America's bioweapons program was fueled by fear and insulated with secrecy.
Biological weapons are designed to kill vast numbers of civilians.
You couldn't have these programs out in the open because the public should not know.
American researchers would enter uncharted territory as they ran an escalating series of experiments, ultimately using human subjects.
I've read the day-to-day notebooks of the laboratory scientists. They never reached an endpoint. They kept pushing that point farther and farther every day.
There is an appeal to these weapons to certain members of the scientific community, almost being seduced by the dark side.
It's essentially invisible. You can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't smell it.
A biological weapon is alive. What it wants to do is survive and reproduce itself inside a host, the human body.
On December 9, 1942, the U.S. government convened a secret meeting at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. Army officers had urgent questions for an elite group of scientists. America and its allies were fighting a horrific world war. Intelligence suggested that Germany might soon target Britain with a terrifying new weapon, a bomb packed with biological agents. The meeting was called to respond to a critical British request. Could the Americans create a large-scale biological warfare program to help their allies, and do it virtually overnight?
If you brought all that we knew about microbiology and infectious diseases into a military context, you could develop a weapon that would be amazingly effective. It would be dangerous. It could change the course of the war.
Only a few months before, the President of the United States had grappled with the issue of biological weapons. "I have been loath to believe that any nation," Franklin Roosevelt said, "even our present enemies, would be willing to loose upon mankind such terrible and inhumane weapons." Secretary of War Henry Stimson thought differently. "Biological warfare is dirty business," he wrote to Roosevelt, "but I think we must be prepared." The President approved the launch of America's biological warfare program. For the first time, U.S. researchers would be trying to make weapons from the deadliest germs known to science. Now, at the request of a desperate ally, America was entering a realm lacking clear ethical limits, where science and secrecy would go hand in hand.
Essentially, the data as presented removes any of these earlier doubts as to our projections.
As the meeting broke up, the researchers were now warned anyone who leaked details of the discussion would face 40 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. By the time of the Washington meeting, German bombs had been raining down on Britain for 2 years. The English feared that the next bomb might carry a biological payload. In July 1942, Britain began secret trials of unconventional weapons on a small Scottish island called Gruinard.
It was picked because of its remoteness, partly for reasons of secrecy, but also partly because there were very few populated areas around the island.
The British believed they had a weapon that would disperse infectious germs into the air. In their labs, they had evaluated a handful of lethal agents. Now in the field, they would test the most promising, the bacterium that causes the dreaded disease, anthrax. Led by bacteriologist Paul Fildes, the team first considered how far beyond the island wind might spread the germs. Then they positioned their subjects, a score of sheep purchased from local crofters. A scaffolding held a bomb packed with hardy anthrax spores.
This was an anti-personnel bomb, but obviously doing experiments with humans with anthrax was out of the question.
Over the next minutes, the cloud of germs passed over the animals. For several days, nothing. Then the sheep began to tremble and stagger. Blood oozed from their bodies shortly before death.
What Fildes' experiments on Gruinard Island had shown was that an anti-personnel biological bomb could be produced. What it did convince the Allies of was that they had a really potent weapon.
Fildes had a successful field trial, but scant resources. To move into production, the British would need American help.
One of the advantages of bringing the US into the research on biological warfare as far as Britain was concerned was that they didn't have the facilities, the resources, the money.
A British politician of the day described the United States as a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. Fildes had lit the boiler. Operating under the Army's Chemical Warfare Service, Camp Detrick would become the top secret enclave for enthusiastic American biowarfare researchers.
They were passionate about their science. They were the best in the country. If someone said to you, here's an unlimited budget, here's all the equipment you need, tell me which kind of building you want to work in, we'll build it, you would jump at that opportunity, and that's exactly what they did. But the imperative was, we need results very quickly.
The American bioweapons program would embody the same security precautions that the British had adopted.
It was the highest level of secrecy. In some cases, there were only 4 or 5 people who actually knew the extent of what was going on at Camp Detrick.
I remember one time we had a party and somebody said, hey, a lot of bacteriologists here, aren't there? That was quickly shushed up. We were taught at Detrick, don't talk about Detrick.
If an activity is conducted in secret, people who can see the mistakes in it or the danger in it or the false assumptions in it may not know about it, even people within the government. And therefore you might embark upon a course which is disastrous.
Detrick's scientific director was Ira Baldwin, the 47-year-old chairman of the bacteriology department at the University of Wisconsin. In one sense, Baldwin was an unlikely choice to lead the project.
He had Quaker roots, very strict way of living, and their morality was that war was not the way you do things. You would think that Dr. Baldwin would have rejected the value of using biological warfare and the ethics of using biological warfare.
Like other Detrick scientists, Baldwin struggled over his decision, but then quickly got down to work. It was wartime.
Not many people today can understand the mindset of 1941 when we were attacked by Japanese. The entire nation was at war, so we had a real mission to protect our nation.
The people who worked in the biological weapons programs were able to convince themselves that there was a patriotic reason for doing this work, that the nation state would be in danger of not surviving if they did not do this work. They lived in a closed moral order.
The British had made two requests. One was for anthrax. Another was for a toxin produced by bacteria, botulinum, the most lethal substance ever discovered.
A person who is poisoned with botulinum toxin develops paralysis. Doctors can watch it creep through the body, and when the paralysis reaches the center of the chest, you have a breathing arrest and a heart attack, and you can't be resuscitated.
The British provided Dietrich with the botulinum recipe. Scaling it up was Ira Baldwin's job. He built a temporary tar paper shack. Protected by guards armed with machine guns, it ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Researchers tested the deadly toxin on mice, but no one could say exactly what would happen in human beings.
1 milliliter will kill 1 million mice. Now, how much would it take to kill a person? I can't answer that. But it's very, very toxic, very potent.
For decades, nations had debated the use of unconventional weapons. In World War I, many saw Germany's use of chlorine gas, a chemical weapon, as an outrageous violation of the norms of war and a corruption of science.
Wonderful things came out of modern chemistry that improved people's lives. But unfortunately, in World War I, you find that a great science can be exploited for military purposes.
In 1925 in Geneva, over 30 nations signed a protocol banning first use of unconventional weapons, germs and chemicals alike.
A chemical weapon is a poison, and it kills usually very rapidly. A biological weapon is a microorganism. A biological weapon is alive. And like all other life forms, what it wants to do is survive and reproduce itself.
The U.S. signed but didn't ratify the Geneva Protocol, an agreement which still permitted research and production of germ weapons. By the late 1930s, as tensions rose in Europe, the door was open to the scientific creation of new weapons of mass destruction.
This war coming in 1939, 1940 was envisioned as a war of scientists against scientists. Whoever had the best scientists was going to win this war.
In 1944, V-1 rockets launched from Germany pounded London, raising British fears of a Nazi biological attack. The fears would prove unfounded, but not before British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had placed an urgent order with the U.S. for 500,000 anthrax bomblets. "Pray let me know when they will be available," he wrote. "We should regard it as a first installment." The British request far exceeded Dietrich's capacity. To fill it, Ira Baldwin began converting an old munitions factory in Vigo, Indiana. The new plant was designed as a gigantic industrial assembly line that could produce anthrax bacteria by the ton. In December 1944, reports came of a potential germ attack on the United States, launched by Japan. Balloons began to fall from the western skies of North America. Amid worries that the balloons might contain a biological agent, Dietrich dispatched a scientist to one of the crash sites. The balloons contained only explosives. Still, the incident fueled the fears that kept America's biological program moving forward. By August 1945, the American biological program had spent $60 million. Thousands of workers at Dietrich and satellite facilities had sacrificed over 500,000 experimental animals while investigating a dozen devastating illnesses. And soon the new Vigo plant would be ready for its first anthrax run. But then came surprising news from Japan. As citizens, the biowarfare researchers celebrated the American victory. But as government scientists, they knew they had a problem. Another unconventional weapon had proved itself in war.
After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, biological weapons were put in a kind of a shadow. They didn't look as powerful or promising as they had before the revelations about what a nuclear weapon could do.
Nuclear weapons were now in ascendance. After 3 frantic years, the U.S. biological warfare program seemed headed for extinction. Then an unexpected reprieve. Not long after the war's end, the U.S. received unconfirmed intelligence of biological weapons research conducted by America's wartime ally, the Soviet Union. The looming Cold War would drive the American program for decades to come. The U.S. germ program was launched in World War II because of reports of German and Japanese bioweapons research. Now, with the war over, America dispatched investigators to uncover the real extent of its defeated enemy's germ technology. In Germany, the U.S. had expected to find a large biological program, but no one calculated that Hitler would constrain the development of a German program.
As it turned out, the German program was very scattered, and Hitler himself had given an order very early in the war that there was to be no offensive biological weapons research.
But in Japan, Americans were surprised by the ways that germ research surpassed what wartime intelligence had suggested. The name of one officer and physician kept coming up. One informant called him the germ man. Another said his entire career starts with germs and ends with germs. He was Shiro Ishii, the driving force behind Japan's secret biological weapons program. Ishii was interrogated by Dietrich investigators in May 1947, and what came out exceeded anything the British or Americans had imagined. Dietrich researchers could now piece together the story of Japan's no-holds-barred germ warfare program. Its headquarters was a facility called Unit 731 in a Japanese-controlled region of China. The site housed 3,000 Japanese personnel and included labs, a Shinto temple, a cinema, and a brothel. Ishii, like his Allied counterparts, understood the need for the utmost secrecy. He operated under a cover as Chief of the Water Purification and Epidemic Corps.
He had tremendous access to human subjects, to mostly peasant Han Chinese, he would just pick people up out of their homes or off the street and bring them in and keep them captive, and also then perform on them really atrocious experiments equal to anything that was ever conducted in the Nazi death camps.
The human experiments always ended in death. Even those who recovered from the disease were killed so that their autopsies could be completed and added to the files. They sought the scientific information so avidly, they often did the autopsy before the patient died so that the tissues would be perfectly fresh. If you look at the number of people who were murdered in the facility in experiments, there were at least 3,000, and more likely closer to 10,000 people.
Ishii and his team infected people with germs causing plague, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. But they had a preferred lethal agent.
They conducted human subjects experiments with anthrax, something that the United States and the United Kingdom scientists may have theorized, but they had never brought themselves to that actuality.
If you inhale anthrax spores into your lungs, you can come down with pulmonary anthrax. It's a very bad disease that is very hard to survive. Your lungs fill up with fluid. Your skin turns blue. The lymph nodes inside the chest can swell up to the size of tennis balls and can rupture. It's a very painful, grisly death.
The Japanese experiments were not confined to the laboratory. They also took place in Chinese cities.
One of the weapons that Ishii developed were fleas that had been infected with the plague bacterium. These were released from airplanes and dropped over Chinese cities.
Outside Ishii's compounds, thousands of Chinese were infected with Black Death and other diseases spread by Japan's forces. The extent of Ishii's experiments amazed the American investigators.
The more they learned about the Japanese program, the more they wanted to know about the Japanese program. The work that the Japanese did was beyond the experience of those American scientists.
The Japanese had crossed an ethical line.
All of the work in America had been done on animals. The Japanese data was a proof test. It showed that a weapon could kill people.
Ishii had kept what appeared to be meticulous records, including autopsy diagrams and microscope slides of human tissue. In exchange for his human data, Ishii wanted immunity from war crimes prosecution for himself and his colleagues. His case came to the top Allied commander in post-war Japan, General Douglas MacArthur. By early 1948, the U.S. understood that it was fighting a Cold War with its former ally. Americans saw the Soviet Union, already in control of Eastern Europe, as a ruthless nation in pursuit of unconventional weapons. That March, MacArthur formally approved a highly secret deal with Ishii. In Nuremberg, Germany, Nazi doctors had been convicted and hanged. The Tokyo war crimes trial would play out differently. Not a single biowarfare case was prosecuted.
The immunity deal was a disgrace. The Japanese workers deserved to be tried for their war crimes. If that had happened, there would have been a precedent against such things.
Dietrich researchers considered the deal helpful for the American germ program. It put unique human data in their hands. It suppressed testimony that might have encouraged Soviet scientists, and it offered something else just as important.
The United States got secrecy around its own program. Think of it. If the Japanese scientists had been prosecuted in Tokyo, the world would have reacted with such horror that it would have been very difficult for Americans to move forward with an offensive biological weapons program.
But thanks to the deal, the program was advancing once again, faster than ever. In the early years of the Cold War, many Americans, and Dietrich workers in particular, feared the worst from the Soviets.
If you had no nuclear weapons, I think the decision would have been we'd better have a biological capability. And we would be in bad shape if we found out that they did and had nothing of that sort ourselves.
Because the U.S. still had few nuclear bombs, germ weapons got a boost.
The biological weapons program was able to step up and at least claim that it could provide a weapon of mass destruction that would augment the atomic arsenal.
With the American biological warfare program ramping up, Dietrich researchers had high hopes for the human data from Japan. They were deeply disappointed.
It turned out that Shiro Ishii was not the kind of scientist they wanted. What they wanted was a scientist who would tell them how many airborne bacteria would infect people a half a mile downwind. There was nothing like this in the Japanese documents.
The U.S. had let war criminals go free in exchange for junk science. American bioweapons researchers now came to a sobering realization. If they wanted reliable human data, they would have to get it themselves. On a sticky August day in 1949, technicians from Dietrich visited the Pentagon on a secret mission. Disguised as maintenance workers, they used simulants, non-infectious bacteria, to assess the vulnerability of people inside large buildings to attack. Only a few of the Pentagon's employees were aware of the test. A technical success, the Pentagon trial revealed the threat and promise of germs for sabotage. But the American biological program had ambitions beyond workers in buildings.
The characteristic of biological weapons is the ability to cover very large areas with wind-borne disease organisms. Automatically, that tells you that if there is any utility to biological weapons, it lies in the attack of civilians.
This is a great change in notions of conducting war, waging war in the 20th century. Your victory may depend greatly on the killing of civilians.
A series of tests were done on American cities. There was still some doubt that biological weapons could be effective against a target the size of a city.
An early trial took place in San Francisco in September 1950. Outside the Golden Gate Bridge, a Navy ship sailed a carefully charted course. It released a plume of simulant bacteria that dispersed like anthrax germs. 3 years later, as the Cold War raged on, American planners took their secret exercises into the American heartland. In St. Louis and Minneapolis, two cities thought to resemble potential Soviet targets, sprayers hidden in cars dispersed invisible clouds of simulants. U.S. citizens knew almost nothing about the American germ program, nor did most of their representatives in Washington. Every year, the House Appropriations Committee approved biowarfare spending within the defense budget. In closed meetings, only a few selected congressmen were briefed on the details. In a period of escalating Cold War tensions, Americans were encouraged by their government to prepare for a germ assault by a ruthless Soviet enemy thousands of miles away. Few were aware of what the U.S. had already done within its own borders. Fewer still knew what was coming next. In 1954, a group of American servicemen, all volunteers, began participating in a series of experiments at Dietrich. They stepped up to a new testing facility. The 8-ball was a 1 million-liter sphere, the largest known aerosol testing chamber in the world. Inside, a sprayer or bomb set up a cloud of microbes. The human subjects were Seventh-day Adventists. Conscientious objectors, they refused to carry arms. But 2,200 of them, called the Whitecoats, agreed to serve in experiments, including inhaling germs they knew might make them sick. All human studies were approved by the Secretary of Defense. Some Whitecoat trials evaluated new vaccines developed at Dietrich, but curing disease was not the primary goal of the studies.
The Adventists were told that they were undergoing these experiments in order to save lives, but in fact, they were undergoing the experiments in order to calibrate a weapon to take lives.
Bill Patrick helped prepare the germs inhaled by the Whitecoats.
You stick your nose into a hood that's attached to a tank, and you don't smell it, you don't see it. The psychological impact of this, I think, would be very, very difficult to take.
In the Whitecoat era, Dietrich scientists worked with a wider variety of germs.
The American biowarfare program seemed to emphasize research into non-lethal biological weapons. Weapons that wouldn't necessarily make an enemy soldier dead, but would make that person pig sick for a long time. A sick soldier is more damaging to an army than a dead soldier. If a soldier is killed, all you need to do is just leave the soldier and continue with the campaign. But an ill soldier is going to require several people to take care of that person.
Hundreds of Whitecoats would eventually inhale germs, including those causing tularemia and sandfly fever. At least half of the exposed men became sick, but all eventually recuperated. Researchers knew that it's one thing to test disease agents in the lab, but quite another to make them work on the battlefield. So in 1955, Dietrich scientists prepared for America's first outdoor test of infectious germs on human subjects. They arranged for a group of Whitecoats to be flown to Utah.
I know that they were not intentionally going to harm us in any way, that they had our best interests at heart. You have to remember, we're 18, 19-year-old kids. It was all kind of a big adventure.
The site chosen for the experiment was the Dugway Proving Ground, located on a remote stretch of desert. At the end of a July day, scientists prepared to release an aerosol of germs that cause Q fever, a debilitating infection. Downwind, Whitecoats waited. A half-mile line of platforms held 30 men, 300 guinea pigs, and 75 monkeys.
The monkeys' faces were blue. It was cold. The wind was coming right at us. I took my blanket and I put it over the monkeys. We knew that when the siren blew, this was a signal to get up, sit on the stool, face the wind, just breathe naturally.
4 minutes for the infectious cloud to reach the test stands. After the trials, men, monkeys, and guinea pigs sat in the silence of the desert. 45 minutes later, the whitecoats were picked up. Their contaminated clothes were incinerated, and the men boarded a flight to return to Maryland that night. Back at Dietrich, the whitecoats passed the time as the researchers waited to see if they'd come down with Q fever.
They had all kinds of activities for us to do. We played games, we had ping pong, we shot pool.
After about 2 weeks, most of the exposed men began to fall ill.
I woke up feeling that I was coming down with the worst case of flu that I ever had. My eyes were very, very sensitive to light. I wanted the room dark. I ached everywhere. I was just incredibly sick, just very, very sick.
The ill men took antibiotics. Though one was hospitalized for months, all of the whitecoats recovered. With the cooperation of Seventh-day Adventists, researchers had proved that wind-borne germs could infect a small group of people under field conditions. Now, with the help of monkeys, they would try to determine if a biological weapon could match the impact of a hydrogen bomb. The test began early in 1965, as barges took position near a Pacific atoll called Johnston.
Inside the barges were cages filled with monkeys. The monkeys were both on the deck of the barge and inside the hold of the barge. There were also human beings wearing spacesuits and probably quite nervous.
A low-flying military plane sprayed a 32-mile line of germs. Germs that cause a lethal disease, tularemia, or rabbit fever. Drifting over a vast swath of ocean, the microbes remained infectious for 60 miles.
The barges were towed back to the island, and in the next days, the monkeys became ill. Ultimately, about half of the monkeys became sick, and of them, most of them died.
These large-scale field tests demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt the feasibility of biological warfare. And that is why we know that one particular agent, when properly stabilized and properly disseminated, is a terrific, very effective weapon system.
In theory, a single jet could knock out a city. It could perhaps infect as many as half the people in Los Angeles with tularemia.
Though skeptics said the results were oversold, Dietrich researchers were jubilant. After 20 years of hard work, they believed they had made the case that biological weapons deserved a place in the U.S. arsenal. In fact, they may have succeeded too well.
I think it frightened the U.S. government. It was relatively easy to make biological weapons, relatively easy to disperse them. It wasn't as difficult by any means as building a hydrogen bomb. There was a thinking here that we don't really want to publicize how powerful these weapons are, because all we're really doing is proving to the rest of the world that biological weapons work.
Even as the trials were being conducted in the Pacific, other events were casting all unconventional weapons in a negative light. News stories broke about the American use of tear gas in Vietnam, the first combat use of a chemical weapon by the U.S. since World War I. America was also spraying a chemical defoliant tested at Dietrich, Agent Orange. Public protest erupted.
Do you think germ warfare would be justified in Vietnam if it shortened the war and saved the lives of U.S. servicemen?
I feel that the best way to save lives of U.S. servicemen is to pull them out of Vietnam immediately.
Adding to the controversy, a news story in February 1969 disclosed an accident at the Army's Dugway Proving Ground. At a nearby Utah ranch, an errant cloud of nerve gas was claimed to have killed 6,000 sheep.
The Army finally admitted that they had conducted experiments in the area with nerve gas agents.
There are too many confusing aspects. We've been working in this area for 25 years in this particular part of this country, and we have never done anything to damage the surrounding areas. If we are the cause of this, we have a problem.
For critics, the incident strengthened the argument that unconventional weapons of all types could not be controlled. For biowarfare researchers, it reinforced the need for secrecy established long ago at Gruinard Island. Germ weapons programs could not survive the sunlight of public scrutiny. In Washington, President Richard Nixon was feeling the mounting political pressure. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, ordered a full review of American chemical and biological weapons policy in May 1969. Among the invited contributors was Harvard biologist Matthew Meselson. Meselson had been pushing for a reassessment of America's unconventional weapons strategy. Working for the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, he had visited Fort Detrick.
I asked my hosts what value they saw in these weapons, and the main answer I got back was that it would save money, that it was cheaper than nuclear weapons. I was amazed at this answer. It took a little thought, but not much, to realize that to pioneer a cheap weapon of mass destruction is exactly what the United States should never do.
Kissinger presented Nixon with Meselson's brief, arguing that biological weapons were redundant with nuclear weapons and easier for poor countries to make. The U.S. had been developing biological warfare since World War II. Now the president's advisors undercut the weapons. They had a short shelf life, they were sensitive to weather, and germs might get out of control. On November 25, 1969, Nixon surprised the world.
Biological warfare, which is commonly called germ warfare. This has massive, unpredictable, and potentially uncontrollable consequences. It may produce global epidemics and profoundly affect the health of future generations. Therefore, I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate. Mankind already carries in its own hands too many of the seeds of its own destruction.
Nixon was under great pressure to do something, and disavowing biological weapons was an easy bone to throw to his critics.
Nixon had killed the American offensive biological weapons program after nearly 3 decades of secret work.
It enabled us to take the moral high ground and to say, we've ended our program, and other countries should do the same.
I thought that the decision he made was historic, was good for the United States, even better, good for all of humanity.
In 1975, the U.S. finally ratified the 1925 Geneva Protocol, banning first use of germ weapons. And a new international agreement went further, prohibiting the development and possession of germ weapons. The Biological Weapons Convention outlawed, for the first time in history, an entire class of weapons.
One of the ironies of the United States biological weapons program was that it created its own monster. Although it was designed to reduce threats to the United States, it in fact increased the threats.
There's something in the military thinking about war and honor which puts biological weapons in a very negative category. It's like dirty weapons. It's like poison. It's like something that somebody does on the sly who really lacks a sense of honor.
We don't fight with poisons. We don't fight with illness. This is alien.